At 11:28 a.m. on March 18, 1946, in the cold dust of a makeshift camp near Fort Sam Houston, Texas, Corporal Takashi Yamada stood at attention, still haunted by the last moments aboard the transport ship. His stomach churned, not from hunger, but from an unfamiliar sensation. The moment was too surreal. The man who had been a prisoner of war just days ago, a soldier of the Imperial Army, was now standing in a US Army mess hall, facing a metal tray. On it, something strange. A burger. Coca-Cola. A sudden rush of heat gripped his chest, sweat beading on his brow. The instructions were clear. Eat. Assimilate. The taste that followed was so alien, so sweet it felt like an assault, his jaw trembling with each forced bite. And yet, in that moment, he knew this small act would unravel everything he thought he knew about survival. His mind fought to grasp the gravity of this first bite. Was this his defeat, or was it something far worse? It was March 1946, and the dust of war had settled over a bruised world. In the stillness of a dusty Texas desert, a group of Japanese soldiers sat in the cramped quarters of a US POW camp. Behind the barbed wire, the soldiers spoke little. After the long days of brutal combat, long forced marches, and the final crushing defeat at the hands of American forces, they were now left with nothing but the strange silence of captivity. Corporal Yamada, once proud in his uniform, now wore the ragged clothes of a prisoner. As the bell rang, signalling the start of their daily meal, Yamada glanced across the room. The other men's eyes, just as tired, looked toward the steel serving tables with a mix of disbelief and wariness. The meal was always the same: rice, thin soup, maybe a piece of bread. But today, something felt different. Sergeant Ishikawa, Yamada's closest companion, was already murmuring in disbelief. "That smell? It's not rice." They all looked up, the metal trays clinking as they were handed out, each one heaping with a round object and a thick slice of something strange. The scent wasn't the familiar steam of rice, but something heavier. Grease, charred meat and salt. The image was alien. The soldier next to Yamada reached for the hamburger, eyes wide. "This is food?" His voice was a whisper, too afraid to speak louder, as if ask it might somehow reverse the reality. It was too much to grasp. War had stripped them of so many things, but now, this? The mess hall hummed with the low sound of uncertainty. Metal scraped against metal. Someone coughed. The American guards stood at the periphery, watching without expression, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. But for the men in their threadbare uniforms, nothing felt natural anymore. Yamada lifted the burger with both hands. The bread was soft, pillowy almost, yielding beneath his fingertips. The weight of it surprised him. He could see the layers, the patty, dark and glistening, the bright green of pickles, something red and wet that might have been a sauce. Steam rose faintly from where the meat touched the bun. Around him, others were attempting the same tentative exploration. Some sniffed cautiously, others simply stared, as if the object might transform into something recognizable if they looked long enough. Yamada took a hesitant bite, the bread soft in his mouth, but the taste overwhelming in its sweetness. The patty was warm and greasy, the pickles crunching beneath his teeth in a way he couldn't understand. But as the food settled in, something else took root. It wasn't hunger that gnawed at him now. It was the recognition that, even as the war had ended, he had been cast adrift, caught in a world so different from the one he'd known that every step felt like stumbling deeper into an alien universe. The American camp was so different from the brutalities they had endured in the Pacific. The men, though their uniforms were plain, did not bear the same weight of history on their shoulders. They had not fought with the fervour of men who thought their nation was at the brink of something divine. For the first time in weeks, Yamada began to feel something new, self-consciousness. No longer a soldier, no longer part of an empire, he was now a prisoner, held captive by his own confusion. And the food, sweet and foreign, seemed to mock the man he once was, an emblem of his complete displacement. The texture was wrong. Everything was wrong. The meat had a sponginess he'd never encountered, a resilience that felt manufactured. The sauce, ketchup he would learn later, was aggressively sweet, coating his tongue with a sticky film that wouldn't dissipate. He chewed mechanically, forcing himself through each bite. Across the table, Private Takahashi had set his burger down after a single bite. His face had gone pale, and he stared at the tray as though it had personally betrayed him. "It tastes like nothing I know," he said quietly. Ishikawa nodded, still holding his own burger at arm's length. "They want us to eat this every day?" The question hung unanswered. In the corner, an American soldier leaned against the wall, smoking a cigarette. He seemed utterly indifferent to the small crisis unfolding before him. To him this was just lunch. To the Japanese prisoners, it felt like the final erasure of everything familiar. Late that night, Yamada sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the metal spoon in his hand. It had been hours since the meal, but the taste still clung to his tongue, like a phantom, like an accusation. His fellow soldiers had been subdued, but now the weight of their shared experience seemed to loom larger. What had this meal meant? Were they supposed to feel gratitude, humiliation, or something else entirely? The mess hall had been silent, but for the clatter of trays. "Do you think they want us to break?" Ishikawa's voice startled Yamada. His friend was leaning against the wall, eyes darting across the room. "Or are they just trying to get us to forget everything?" The question hung between them, unanswered, but the tension was undeniable. The soldiers of the Imperial Army had fought to the last, upheld by a conviction that had driven them to survive. But now, they were faced with a challenge they had never been trained for. The bewildering experience of being treated like ordinary men, not warriors. The line between respect and humiliation was thin, and the taste of the burger felt like the weight of that thin line. Through the small window above his bunk, Yamada could see the Texas sky, vast and empty, stars scattered across the darkness like rice grains spilled on black cloth. He thought of home, of the smell of miso soup in the morning, of pickled vegetables and grilled fish. Simple things, real things. "I don't know what they want," Yamada finally answered, "but I know what we're losing." Ishikawa turned to face him fully. In the dim light from the hallway, his features looked gaunt, older than his 26 years. "Every bite?" "Every bite," Yamada confirmed. Around them, other men lay in their bunks, some sleeping, others staring at the ceiling. The barracks smelled of sweat and dust and something else. A faint, lingering sweetness that might have been the Coca-Cola or might have been imagination. Either way, it wouldn't fade. The next morning, Yamada could hardly eat. The sight of the hamburgers, the Coca-Cola, which had been delivered with great ceremony, only intensified his disorientation. The men around him were consuming the strange food without question, as though they were following an unspoken rule. But Yamada's hands trembled as he reached for the can of soda. His fingers brushed the cool surface, the bubbles tickling his senses. He had read about such things, but never had he imagined that one day he would hold it in his hand. The first sip was like an electric shock, a rush of sweetness that made his throat close up. He coughed and looked around, only to see the same disbelief mirrored in his fellow prisoners' eyes. They ate in silence, and then Yamada heard the first cracks. It was subtle at first, an odd murmur, a cough, and then one of the men, Takahashi, finally cracked. "It's not real," he muttered, his voice shaking. "This isn't real." The carbonation had been violent, aggressive. Yamada had expected water, perhaps tea, something that settled rather than attacked. Instead, the Coca-Cola had fizzed against the roof of his mouth, the bubbles sharp and insistent. The sweetness was beyond anything he'd experienced. Not the gentle sweetness of fruit or the measured sweetness of traditional confections, but something almost violent in its intensity. "Drink it slowly," one of the guards called out in broken Japanese. "Is good. You like." But liking had nothing to do with it. This wasn't about preference or taste. This was about the dissolution of everything they understood about food, about nourishment, about the rituals that made them human. Sergeant Watanabe, the oldest among them at 42, set his can down with deliberate care. His hands were shaking. He had fought in China, survived Guadalcanal, endured the transport ship that brought them here, but this simple can of soda seemed to undo him in a way that combat never had. "They're drowning us in sugar," he said quietly. "Drowning us in sweetness until we forget what real food tastes like." The mental strain was beginning to show. Yamada's unit, once proud and resolute, had begun to crumble from within. The combination of physical hardship and the psychological shock of being prisoners had begun to erode their sense of self. They had come to America expecting punishment, but this strange hospitality, this attempt to feed them comfort and familiarity, only made things worse. Takahashi, barely able to speak, was pacing the camp, muttering to himself. His thoughts were incoherent, each sentence more disjointed than the last. The Coke cans were stacking up in the corner, abandoned, each one a reminder of a world they had no place in. The breakthrough, the arrival of hamburgers and sodas, seemed like an attempt to force them to adapt, but the more they consumed, the more the truth settled in. Their will to endure had been replaced with something even more dangerous. The reality of their survival was no longer about staying alive. It was about confronting a world they no longer recognized. By the third day, Takahashi had stopped eating entirely. He would sit at the table, staring at his tray, but never lifting the food to his mouth. The guards noticed, but didn't intervene. They seemed to be waiting for something. Capitulation, perhaps, or acceptance. Yamada watched his friend deteriorate. Takahashi's eyes had taken on a glassy quality, unfocused and distant. When spoken to, he would respond in fragments, half sentences that trailed off into silence. "The taste," Takahashi whispered once, grabbing Yamada's arm. "It's replacing everything. I can't remember what mother's cooking tasted like." The panic in his voice was real, visceral. It wasn't about the food itself. It was about what the food represented. Every hamburger was an erasure. Every sip of Coca-Cola was a step further from home, from identity, from the men they had been. In the corner of the barracks, Private Sato had begun keeping a journal. He wrote in tiny characters, filling page after page with descriptions of meals from his childhood: grilled mackerel, miso soup with tofu, rice balls wrapped in seaweed, as though by writing them down he could preserve them against the onslaught of American plenty. The following days were filled with awkward moments. The soldiers began to avoid their meals, staring at the hamburgers like they were poison. Each bite of the strange food felt like a step away from who they had been. There was an internal struggle. Should they reject it and cling to their last vestiges of identity, or should they swallow it down and risk being swallowed up by it? Yamada sat alone, staring at the fading light from his small window. The voices of his comrades drifted in from the mess hall. "They want us to be like them," Ishikawa said, "like we were never anything different." The words stung. The men were being asked to forget their history, their culture, their purpose. And now they had to choose, become part of the new world, or hold on to their past and risk losing themselves completely. A curious pattern had emerged. Some of the younger prisoners, those who had been conscripted late in the war, who had less invested in the ideology of empire, began to eat with less resistance. Private Kimura, only 19 years old, had actually asked for seconds one afternoon. The request had been met with stunned silence from his fellow prisoners. "It's just food," Kimura had said defensively, avoiding their eyes. "We have to eat something." But it wasn't just food. Sergeant Watanabe had pulled Kimura aside later, speaking to him in low, urgent tones. Yamada couldn't hear the words, but he could see the shame on Kimura's face, the way his shoulders hunched forward as though bearing a physical weight. That night, the divisions became clear. Some men ate mechanically, treating it as fuel and nothing more. Others refused entirely, accepting only rice and water when available, and a few, a troubling few, seemed to embrace the new food with something approaching enthusiasm. Yamada found himself in the middle ground, eating enough to survive, but never enough to satisfy. He would take small bites, chewing slowly, trying to minimize contact between the foreign flavors and his tongue. It was a compromise, and like all compromises, it satisfied no one. March gave way to April, and the Texas heat began to build. In the barracks, tempers flared over small things, a borrowed cup, a loud conversation, the way someone chewed their food. The stress of captivity and cultural displacement had created a powder keg, and every meal was a potential spark. One afternoon, an argument erupted between Watanabe and Kimura. The young private had been caught teaching another prisoner English words: hamburger, ketchup, delicious. To Watanabe, this was collaboration, a betrayal of their shared identity. "You shame us all," Watanabe hissed, his face inches from Kimura's. "Learning their language, eating their food with a smile. Have you forgotten who you are?" Kimura's jaw tightened. "I remember exactly who I am. I'm a man trying to survive. What are you doing besides making everyone miserable?" The confrontation drew a crowd. Men gathered in a loose circle, watching with varying expressions of interest and concern. Yamada stood at the edge, uncertain whether to intervene. "Survival at what cost?" Watanabe demanded. "If we become them, what was the point of fighting? We might as well have surrendered at the start." "We did surrender," Kimura shot back. "Or have you forgotten that too? The war is over. We lost. This is what defeat looks like." The words landed like physical blows. Several men flinched. Watanabe's face went red, then white. For a moment, Yamada thought the sergeant might actually strike Kimura. Instead, he turned and walked away, his back rigid with suppressed fury. The crowd dispersed slowly, men returning to their bunks without speaking. But the damage had been done. The unspoken truth, that they had been defeated, that their cause had been lost, that their emperor had surrendered, had been voiced aloud, and with it came the question none of them wanted to face. If the old world was gone, what did they owe to its memory? That evening, Kimura sat alone at dinner, and no one met his eyes. He ate his hamburger in silence, each bite a statement of defiance or surrender, depending on who was watching. By mid-April, the psychological toll had become undeniable. The camp doctor, an American captain named Morrison, began conducting interviews with the prisoners. He spoke no Japanese, working through an interpreter, a Nisei soldier from California whose presence created its own complicated feelings among the POWs. Yamada was called in on April 18th. He sat across from Morrison in a small office that smelled of antiseptic and paper. The doctor's questions were gentle but probing. How was he sleeping? What was his appetite like? Did he experience intrusive thoughts or memories? Yamada answered carefully, revealing little. But when Morrison asked about the food, something in Yamada's expression must have given him away. "The hamburgers," Morrison said through the interpreter. "They're causing problems, aren't they?" Yamada considered lying, then decided against it. "They taste like defeat," he said simply. The interpreter hesitated before translating. Morrison leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "That's not what they're meant to taste like." "Perhaps not," Yamada replied, "but that is what they taste like to us." Morrison made notes in his file. "Would it help if we provided more traditional foods, rice, vegetables, fish?" The question surprised Yamada. He had assumed the American food was mandatory, a deliberate policy. The idea that it might simply be ignorance or convenience had never occurred to him. "Yes," he said quietly, "it would help." But even as he said it, Yamada wondered if it was true. The damage might already be done. They had been introduced to this new world of excess and sweetness and plenty. Could they unlearn it? Could they return to the simpler tastes of home, or had those flavors already been corrupted by contrast? Morrison promised to speak to the quartermaster. As Yamada left the office, he felt something unexpected, a small flicker of hope. Perhaps they weren't meant to be broken. Perhaps this had all been a misunderstanding, a cultural gap that could be bridged. But that night, when rice appeared alongside the hamburgers in the mess line, several men refused it. They had already adapted, already crossed over. The rice looked wrong to them now. Too plain, too simple, insufficient. The division was complete. Weeks later, Yamada could no longer sleep. The pressure had taken its toll. His body and mind no longer belonged to him. The taste of the hamburgers had become an unshakable memory. There were moments when he would reach for the food and the bubbles, but each sip now felt like a betrayal. One evening, during roll call, a soldier finally broke. Takahashi had stopped moving, his eyes glassy, his mouth dry. A single word escaped his lips. "No." The sound was barely a whisper, but it rang louder than the clatter of boots on the ground. The refusal to eat, the refusal to comply, was more than rebellion. It was an act of surrender. Takahashi had broken under the pressure, unable to reconcile his identity with the world now surrounding him. The guards called for Morrison immediately. Takahashi was led away to the infirmary, moving like a man in a dream. His lips kept forming words, but no sound emerged. Yamada watched him go, feeling something cold settle in his chest. That night, word spread through the barracks. Takahashi had suffered what Morrison called a complete psychological break. The technical language meant nothing to the prisoners. What they understood was simpler. One of their own had been destroyed, not by bullets or bombs, but by the accumulated weight of displacement and strangeness. "It could have been any of us," Ishikawa said quietly. He was sitting on his bunk, hands clasped between his knees. "It still could be." Yamada didn't disagree. The line between holding on and letting go felt thinner every day. He had watched himself in the small mirror in the latrine that morning and barely recognized the face looking back. Thinner, older, with eyes that held too much confusion and not enough conviction. Around the barracks, men whispered their theories. Some blamed the food, the sugar, the grease, the chemicals they were certain lurked in the Coca-Cola. Others blamed the heat, the boredom, the absence of purpose. A few blamed themselves for not being strong enough, resilient enough, Japanese enough. But Yamada thought the truth was simpler and more terrible. They had been warriors in a world that valued warriors. Now they were prisoners in a world that wanted to turn them into something else entirely. And the transformation was killing them one small bite at a time. The following days saw many soldiers fall into the same state of despair. Yamada could no longer understand where the line between survival and death lay. He had never known such darkness, not in the midst of battle, not during the relentless air strikes over the Pacific. There, at least, there had been an enemy. Here, the enemy was themselves. The food, the drink, the strange routines, they were tools of an unseen force. The once proud soldiers, hardened by years of war, were now as fragile as glass. Morrison increased his rounds. He moved through the barracks with a clipboard and a concerned expression, noting which men were eating, which were sleeping, which had stopped speaking entirely. 2 more prisoners were transferred to the infirmary in the week following Takahashi's breakdown. The camp commander, a colonel named Patterson, visited personally. He walked the compound with Morrison, their voices low and serious. Yamada caught fragments of their conversation. Never seen this kind of reaction? Cultural sensitivity training. Might need to separate them. The last phrase sent a chill through Yamada. Separate them? From each other? The thin threads that still connected them to their former lives were the bonds of shared experience, shared language, shared loss. To sever those would be to complete the destruction that the hamburgers had begun. That evening, Yamada made a decision. He gathered the men who still seemed coherent, about 20 in total, less than half their original number. They met in the corner of the barracks, speaking in hushed tones. "We have to remember," Yamada said, "not just what we were, but who we are now. We're not soldiers anymore, but we're not Americans either. We're something in between." Sergeant Watanabe shook his head. "There is no in between. We're either ourselves or we're lost." "We're already lost," Kimura interjected. "The question is whether we stay lost or find a new way." The debate continued late into the night. Some men argued for complete resistance, refusing all American food, all American customs, all accommodation. Others advocated for pragmatic acceptance, and a few, like Yamada, searched for middle ground that might not exist. By the time they dispersed, nothing had been resolved, but something had shifted. They had acknowledged the crisis, named it, given it form, and in doing so, they had taken the first small step toward confronting it. Yamada stood before the mess hall again on a morning in early May. His heart pounded in his chest, and yet there was a strange calm in his eyes. He had endured the worst. He had been broken, but he had not yet surrendered. With a final glance at the food that had brought them to the brink, he walked away. He knew it wasn't about the food anymore. It was about remembering who they had been, to survive, to endure, and to rebuild. No matter what they ate, no matter how they were treated, there would always be a part of them that could not be erased. The sky was clear that morning, the Texas sun already fierce at 8 a.m. Yamada had decided not to enter the mess hall. Instead, he walked to the fence line, where the barbed wire marked the boundary between captivity and the vast emptiness beyond. A guard watched him but didn't intervene. Yamada wasn't trying to escape. Where would he go? He simply needed to stand at the edge, to remind himself that edges existed, that there were still boundaries and definitions in a world that seemed determined to blur them all. Behind him he heard footsteps. Ishikawa approached, then Watanabe, then several others. They formed a loose line along the fence, not speaking, simply standing together in silent acknowledgement. This became their new ritual. Every morning, before breakfast, a group of them would walk to the fence and stand for 10 minutes. They didn't pray or speak or perform any ceremony. They simply stood, grounding themselves in the physical reality of where they were and what they had become. The guards found it peculiar but harmless. Morrison noted it in his reports as a positive sign, evidence of emerging group cohesion and coping mechanisms. He didn't understand that it was more than coping. It was resistance of a kind he couldn't recognize because it didn't resist anything external. It was an internal fortification, a shoring up of identity against erosion. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to work. The men who participated in the fence ritual ate with less distress. They slept more soundly. They spoke more freely. They remained prisoners, remained displaced, remained caught between worlds, but they had found a way to be those things without being destroyed by them. Weeks later, the camp was quieter. The men were beginning to adapt, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The defeat of their bodies was not enough to break them, but the defeat of their spirits had been far more difficult to overcome. Yamada watched as the others slowly returned to their routines. Some had begun to speak to the American guards. Others had started learning English, but the wounds remained. By June, Morrison reported marked improvement in the prisoners' psychological state. The crisis had passed. Takahashi and the others in the infirmary were slowly recovering, though they would never be quite the same. The camp settled into an uneasy normalcy, but normalcy was relative. The hamburgers continued to arrive, 3 times a week now instead of daily. Rice had become a regular offering, along with vegetables and occasionally fish. The men ate both, moving between American and Japanese foods with a fluidity that would have seemed impossible 2 months earlier. Kimura had become something of an unofficial liaison between the prisoners and the guards. His English improved rapidly, and he helped translate not just words, but cultural contexts. Some of the older prisoners viewed this as collaboration. Others recognized it as survival. Watanabe had softened his stance, though he never fully embraced the changes. He ate what was provided, but maintained strict personal rituals, washing his hands in a particular way before meals, saying a quiet prayer to ancestors before taking the first bite. These small acts of continuity seemed to sustain him. Yamada found himself occupying a strange middle space. He ate the American food without pleasure, but without resistance. He learned enough English to communicate basic needs. He participated in the fence ritual every morning and helped organize evening discussions where the men could speak in Japanese about anything: home, families, memories of food and festivals, and ordinary life. The camp had become its own peculiar world, neither fully Japanese nor fully American. The men within it were transforming, whether they wanted to or not. Some transformations were visible: weight gained, languages learned, new habits formed. Others were invisible but deeper: shifts in worldview, in self-concept, in understanding what it meant to be defeated and yet still alive. Years after the war, in 1963, Yamada would find himself back in Japan, sitting in a quiet room in Yokohama. He had rebuilt his life, married, worked as a translator, raised 2 children. The war had become history, his time in Texas a strange interlude that sometimes felt like a dream, but the memories of the hamburgers, the soda, and the strange meals haunted him, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a reminder of the true cost of survival. The world had changed, and so had he. He had once believed that survival was about defeating the enemy. Now he knew the true battle was within. He had been invited to speak at a university, to share his experiences as a prisoner of war. The students sat before him with notebooks and earnest faces, wanting to understand what it had been like, what lessons could be drawn from that time. Yamada spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who had spent years thinking about these questions. He talked about the food, not as a trivial detail, but as the focal point of a profound cultural and personal crisis. The hamburger was not just food, he told them. It was a symbol of everything we had lost and everything we were becoming. Every bite was a negotiation between past and future, between identity and survival. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Do you eat hamburgers now, Yamada-san?" He smiled slightly. "Sometimes. My children love them, and when I eat them now, they taste different, just like food. The war is gone from them." But that wasn't entirely true. Even now, decades later, there was a moment of hesitation before that first bite, a ghost of the confusion and displacement he had felt in Texas. The taste could still transport him, not to defeat, but to that liminal space where he had ceased to be one thing, and had not yet become another. The weight of his reflection would last a lifetime, not as trauma exactly, but as knowledge. He had learned that identity was more fragile than he'd imagined, and more resilient. It could be shaken by something as simple as food, and it could survive anything, even its own transformation.